Hunting for treasure in the sewers and smashing snails for clothing materials do not sound like very fun times. However, some people in history had absolutely no choice but to accept these nasty jobs. First up, we have leech collectors. You might be wondering why anyone would want to collect these nasty creatures, but people in the medieval era actually believed these things had healing powers. Because leeches like to latch onto humans, many believe that they could actually suck diseases out of a person's bloodstream. Yeah, that sounds pretty outrageous, but this was an extremely popular method in medieval medicine. It was so popular that many people were actually taking on jobs as leech collectors. This would require a person to head into some of the nastiest waters you can imagine and pick up as many of these little critters as they possibly could. They would then turn around and sell them to doctors and apothecaries so they could use them on their patients. Now obviously this job carried many health risks, as leech collectors would almost always get bit themselves. And although these creatures were supposed to be sucking diseases out of a person's body, they would usually pass on a whole host of new infections. Next up we have armpit pluckers. Yeah, there's absolutely nothing good about this job. This one dates all the way back to the Roman Empire, where apparently many rulers were very keen on achieving the hairless look. This involved shaving and trimming every part of the body, and this included their nasty old armpits. Of course, these rulers had no desire to do this themselves, so they actually hired people to show up with tiny tools and pluck their armpits. The pay was probably terrible, and there's just no way you could feel good about yourself doing this kind of job. Unfortunately, these people couldn't even aspire to be barbers, as their sole job was to pluck the armpits and nothing else. You would also need to be on standby whenever the rulers needed a trim, so you couldn't really go too far from the job site at any given time. Sadly, there was really nothing to gain from this kind of a job, and self-pride was just non-existent. Up next we have body snatchers. Stealing corpses and selling them on the black market definitely doesn't sound like a legal profession. Yet despite all of the laws they were most likely breaking, body snatchers somehow managed to make a pretty decent living hundreds of years ago. Autopsies were slowly but surely becoming more popular in the 17th century, but most people still believed in the resurrection of the corpse. This meant that there were coroners and pathologists looking for work, but they didn't have too many bodies to examine. This is where the body snatchers would come into play. These people would dig up graves in the middle of the night and drag the bodies out of the ground to then sell them on the black market. They actually made a pretty decent living, as coroners always wanted new subjects, but it was obviously very illegal. Not only was the job incredibly inhumane, but it was also just downright nasty. Next on our list are the Toshers. Rummaging through sewage for hidden treasure actually helped some people make a living hundreds of years ago. The Victorian era was full of dirty jobs, and this one just might be the worst of them all. Deep below the streets of London, Toshers would scavenge the city's sewage systems in search of buried treasures. Times were very tough for many people during the Victorian era. This meant that they would pretty much do anything to make a buck. As it turns out, some valuables would get lost in the sewage system from time to time, and Toshers were the ones who would go looking for them. Even if it meant having to rummage through human feces, Toshers would pretty much take anything that they thought they could sell at the market and try to turn a profit. Even women would sometimes be subjected to this nasty job so they could help provide for their families. It's pretty obvious to see why the profession never made it into the modern era. After that we have sin eaters. That might sound like the name of a horrific creature from a fictional story, but sin eaters were actually granted an incredibly disturbing job during the Victorian era. In certain cases, when a person would pass away, families of the deceased would hire a person known as a sin eater to enjoy a meal at their home. It sounds like a pretty simple job at first, until you realize that the chest of the deceased must be used as the dinner table. That's right, while some people were stealing bodies out of the ground in this time period, others were using them as a dinner table to enjoy a hearty meal. Some people believe that the food would absorb any sins that the deceased had committed during their lifetime. This would seemingly help them make it into heaven. The only catch is the person eating the meal would then absorb the sins and take them on as their own. So the only way for the sin eater to get rid of their newly acquired sins would be to repeat this bizarre process once they had passed. Up next we have Chandalas. This title from ancient India covers a wide variety of jobs that were all equally disgusting. Anyone who was labeled a Chandala was considered one of the dirtiest people around, and they would be forced to handle all of the nastiest jobs. Men and women could both fall under this category. These people were generally forced to live outside the city limits and stay away from the rest of the citizens. Jobs were usually brought to them so they didn't have to enter the city, and the pay was obviously very low. In addition to having to work with dirt and fecal matter all day long, most people absolutely hated your guts. Because Chandalas spent their whole lives working with nasty substances, everyone was convinced that they were carrying terrible diseases. So while anyone who took this job probably didn't have a very good image already, earning the official Chandala title really didn't make things any better. Next on on our list are the plague bearers. The Black Plague was quite possibly the worst pandemic the world has ever seen and destroyed a large chunk of Europe's population. In fact, things were so out of control for a while that people were falling ill in the middle of the street and just wouldn't get back up. This problem was so bad that many rulers were hiring people known as plague bearers who would have to clear the streets at night. This job required the bearers to search every corner of every street and alley and take away all of the bodies that never made it inside. Plague bearers would then have to take the bodies to a burial site outside of the city to try and dispose of the plague. Of course, this meant that the bearers themselves were exposed to the terrible disease and would more than likely catch it themselves. This profession really only had one outcome. This only added to the growing number of plague victims. After that, we have farming. Alright, it might sound pretty normal, but this job had drastically changed over the course of time. Although men were usually the ones doing the farming hundreds of years ago, women would sometimes be forced into these jobs by their masters. While farming is a normal trade that is part of our day-to-day lives, the working conditions that were in place hundreds of years ago were incredibly inhumane. Many people would be forced to work in the open fields from sunrise to sunset, and more often than not they would be starved and dehydrated. As long as the masters received their crop and the work was complete, they really didn't care what happened to the workers. It didn't matter if it was a man or a woman in the field, some of these farmers were just slaves that didn't receive any basic human rights. Unless you were an independent contractor with your own farm to work with, you probably didn't want to take on this job under the command of a nasty ruler. Up next are purple dye makers. Here's another one that doesn't really sound all that strange until you find out how they do it. Purple was one of the most sought after colors in the medieval era and everyone wanted to have it. Royals were paying big money for purple robes and crowns, and even the common folk were trying their best to get their hands on the substance. Of course, it also meant that dye makers could make some decent money off of it. The process of making it was a little nastier than you might think. The substance that was required to make dye was actually extracted from tiny shellfish and snails, and it was one person's job to smash thousands of these creatures to bits. It was a pretty inhumane practice, and it also meant you would be stinking of shellfish 24/7. Apparently it would take thousands of mollusks just to create one robe, so you can only imagine how many snails these people would have to crush in their lifetime. Of course, you would have to collect these creatures as well, which meant spending a lot of time in some very smelly waters. And finally, we have pure finders. Well, if you ever wanted to sniff the cover of a very old book, you might want to pull away. It turns out the bindings that were used on the most luxurious books were actually made from dog feces. 18th and 19th century tanneries discovered the canine's fecal matter was the best material for creating the leather bindings, and they were paying decent money to get it. They decided to call it pure, and that was probably just to deter people from the fact that they were holding feces in their hands. However, this did spawn a new career path of pure finders who would search the streets for any doggy duty they could find. The competition in this field was actually pretty tough as well, since many people were doing anything for a buck in this time period. And since books were so popular in this era, there was always a constant need for more pure. Even though it might have paid well, this was one job that should have been avoided at all costs. And that wraps up our look at the disgusting jobs that women were forced to do in history. Thankfully, most of these have been left in the past, and people can carry on with some far more rewarding careers. Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you all next time.